أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. As you see from the title, the lecture of today, inshallah, the first lecture of today, because we will be having two lectures. Dr. Ghaly will be joining and will be addressing the second topic. But the lecture of today is kind of a continuation of what we started yesterday. So I know it may be very theoretical, sometimes abstract, but actually we are just clearing the ground in order, to talk about more practical things in the coming days. But those discussions on epistemology, on theology within the tradition, I think they are very crucial, because actually the status of affairs of the Islamic thought today is only a reflection of that history. So we cannot understand, how Islamic thought is addressing contemporary issues today without understanding where it's coming from, without understanding its history, and without understanding how it's epistemologically constructed, and without understanding also the epistemological flaws and methodological flaws that has occurred during the history. All of this is very crucial to understand in order to know, to understand the contemporary Islamic discourse on different issues. Because it's, like I said, it's just a consequence of, an accumulative process during history. Fiqh today is not, is a consequence of something that happened throughout history. Of course, it's also a consequence of the modern reality as a reaction to modern reality. But this reaction is formulated the way it is because of a historical process, and this we need to understand in order to know where we stand as it comes to Islamic ethics today, or as it comes to Islamic thought in general today. And it's also crucial to know how to move forward with contemporary Islamic thought. So this is why I think we should, it's necessary to have those sessions, that are theoretical and at the same time that are talking about historical thought. It's not just, an intellectual exercise. So the title is Islamic Ethics Resuming Ibn Taymiyya's Epistemological Revolution. We already started yesterday with this issue. And we said that Ibn Taymiyya actually he lived in the around the 7th, 8th century of the Hijrah, 14th century of the Christian calendar, and he lived in a period where already actually the Islamic intellectual production came to kind of a stagnation, it came to a stop already. And the status of affair of Islamic intellectual production was already, in decreasing. Correct me if I'm wrong. Decreasing, and also, of course, the political, landscape where Ibn Taymiyya was also very problematic, because he came in a period where the Islamic Caliphate in Baghdad has collapsed. So this was one of the biggest, or maybe the biggest disaster that have ever touched, the Islamic civilization. It's just a collapse of the Islamic, political entity. So on the one hand, and on the other hand, there is an intellectual stagnation, and there is a problem on the level of the intellectual production, and also on the intellectual legacy. And actually Ibn Taymiyya was involved in both in both challenges, the political and military challenge, and also the intellectual challenge. He was involved in both of them. As for the intellectual side, like we saw yesterday, he was thinking that Islamic thought and Islamic intellectual production during history was deviated from its real purpose and deviated from its real foundations for reasons that we already have explained yesterday. So, mainly for Ibn Taymiyya, the base of the epistemological deviation, when we talk about epistemological deviation, we are talking about the way of reasoning that was developed by the scholars, the way, a system of reasoning through which they would address the text and the reality. This is what we talk about when we talk about the epistemology. A system of reasoning that they developed and that they applied on the revelation and that they applied on the reality. And for Ibn Taymiyya, this epistemology, this way of reasoning was deviating for a main reason that we have already also explained yesterday, is that according to him, Islamic thought turned its back to the rationality of the Quran as it is presented throughout the revelation, throughout the texts. And they formulated a hybrid epistemology, a hybrid way of reasoning that was not completely Islamic and not completely from the Greek philosophy, but it was a mix of that. So, for instance, in his book, Dar Ta'arud al-Aql wal-Naql, which is actually an encyclopedia where he tried to tackle the issue of reason and revelation. And he starts in the very beginning of the book with highlighting what he thinks is the biggest issue and the biggest epistemological flaw within, the Islamic trends. And he says that he quotes Fakhruddin al-Razi. It's a long quote in the very beginning of his book, which comes from the book of Fakhruddin al-Razi, which is called Asas al-Taqdis, the foundations of sacralization. Actually, Asas al-Taqdis, Fakhr al-Razi took a lot from al-Ghazali, and even this word, this concept, Asas al-Taqdis, the foundations of sacralization, even al-Ghazali himself has used it in his book Al-Qanun al-Kulli fi al-Ta'wil from al-Ghazali. And of course, Ibn Taymiyya, when he replied to Fakhr al-Razi, he said actually this book should be called Asas al-Tadnis, not Asas al-Taqdis, the foundations of profanation. Profanity, yeah. So he quoted Fakhr al-Razi, and Fakhr al-Razi was saying that if you have revelation contradicting reason, then you should give priority to reason above revelation. And Ibn Taymiyya, he says that this is the basis on which the deviation, so I call it epistemological deviation, this is a modern term, but this is what he means, the deviation of all the groups is built. This duality between reason and revelation, and the fact that reason should take over from revelation. Now, let me ask you a question, because yesterday I have said that for the Ash'ari school, there is no objective value in creation, neither in the human, which means that neither in human fitra, which means that the reason is dismissed in the Ash'ari school. I said this yesterday. It's dismissed because the only source is revelation, because reason cannot identify good and bad. Why? Because good and bad does not exist. So the only way good and bad does not exist objectively. So the only way to identify good and bad, what is it? Revelation. Because good and bad is only a subjective value that revelation came to attribute to things. So I can only know if things are good and bad by revelation, because my reason will not enable me to identify it, because it's not there objectively. So here what I'm saying now, it seems to contradict what I said yesterday, because yesterday I said that reason was dismissed because it's not useful, it cannot identify. And now I'm saying that the issue with those groups is that they give priority to reason above revelation. So is this a contradiction?
It sounds like it. Sounds like
it's not a contradiction.
It's not.
Because actually what they mean by reason is this epistemology that they put for themselves. And they claim that this epistemology is coming from the Quran and it's coming from revelation. So it's for them it's revelation. And I have here a quote of Al-Ghazali, you can quote him if you want, that he say for instance, Al-Ghazali took Aristotelian, is the first one first scholar who has introduced Aristotelian logics as an epistemological frame for all Islamic sciences, for everything. For him, the epistemological reference to understand Quran and everything and all Islamic sciences is Aristotelian logics. But he did not say clearly that he took it from Aristotle, but it's clear in the content. And he said he derived it from the Quran. Ibn Taymiyya, in replying to him, he said this. He said he's saying I derived this from the Quran, but he derived it from Aristotle. So, which means that for them this is not. This is for them. This is a rationality. This is an epistemology that is Quranic for them, and they say it's through this epistemology that you should understand Quran. So when they are saying that reason should have priority on revelation, is this epistemology that they build for themselves that should have. This is the reason that they are talking about, that should have priority on revelation, because they are claiming that this stems out of revelation. Do you see how there is no contradiction or not?
Not quite clear.
Okay, maybe it will become later, inshallah.
So is it the epistemology that comes from the Quran versus taking the Quran in terms of its literal content? Is that the difference?
No. When those people are talking, especially the Ash'aris, are talking about reason, and even the Mu'tazilas, they put for themselves a set of rational tools. And for them, those rational tools, the revelation should submit to it. And if the revelation contradicts these rational tools, well, as it comes from the hadith, it's just rejected, whether it's Mu'tazila or Ash'ira. As it comes from the Quran, it should be ta'wil, it should be interpreted in order to fit to this rational, or to this rational tools. Because reason has priority on revelation, but for instance, Al-Razi said it clearly, and he's meaning this reason, this asas al-taqdis that he put as a epistemology, and for others, for Al-Ghazali, for instance, this is the way that revelation should be read, and if it's not fitting within this epistemology, it should be just interpreted. And for instance, we know that Ash'ira, they don't accept hadith in Aqidah. They don't accept it. Hadith al-Ahad, but the most hadith are Ahad anyhow. So I hope this brings more clarity. So Ibn Taymiyya is replying to this in his encyclopedia, Dar Ta'arud al-Aql wal-Naql. And he is saying that actually, when he quoted Fakhruddin al-Razi, died 606, somewhere in the 12th century of Hijrah, of Christian calendar. He said actually he took this from Al-Ghazali, like I said, from his book Al-Qanun al-Kulli fi al-Ta'wil, and he said that the student of Al-Ghazali, which is Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi, he rejected a lot of those elements that Ghazali came with, saying that my master, so Ghazali, he entered into the stomach of the philosophy, but he was not able to get out of it. But he said, Ibn Taymiyya says that this Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi himself, he put also a hybrid epistemology that is contradicting Quran, that he took from the master of Al-Ghazali, which is Abu al-Ma'ali al-Juwayni, and that he himself also took from Abu Bakr, from others, or that others before him also developed, like Abu Bakr al-Baqillani. And he says, then he, after saying this, he says, وَمِثْلُ هَذَا الْقَانُونَ الَّذِي وَضَعَهُ هَؤُلَاء. This qanun, this law, so this epistemology in modern terminology, this epistemology that those have established, يضع كل فريق لأنفسهم قانونا فيما جاء به الأنبياء عن الله. Each group, they establish an epistemology, they establish a law that they apply to understand what the prophets came with. فيجعلونه الأصل الذي يعتقدونه ويعتمدونه. And they make it the base in which they believe and which they use. ويعتمدونه هو ما ظنوا أن عقولهم عرفته ويجعلون ما جاءت به الأنبياء تبعا له. And they make what the prophets came with, so the revelation, they make it follow it, or they submit it to this epistemology that they develop. فما وافق قانونهم قبلوه وما خالفه لم يتبعوه. And everything from revelation that goes along with their epistemology, they take it, and everything that goes against it, they don't follow it. So what we can understand here, and what is important to understand, because Ibn Taymiyya often he is accused to be a literalist, that is refusing reasoning and is refusing rationality, which is totally untrue. Ibn Taymiyya is not opposing rationality and is not opposing, and he's not a literalist. He's opposing a certain rationality, which is a rationality that does not stem out of the text, out of revelation. They did not use revelation to develop their epistemology. They used something else to develop their epistemology. It's not a revelation-based epistemology, and this is what Ibn Taymiyya is contradicting. And he is calling for a rationality that is revelation-based, because he is saying that revelation has the ability also to make us develop a philosophy that is based on it. While those groups, they're saying that revelation is there as a bayan, as a discourse. So, like I said yesterday, it's not useful to develop from it a rationality. It cannot give birth to more than what's contained in it in its literal sense. So this is the base of the epistemological deviation according to Ibn Taymiyya. And of course we see that Al-Mu'tazila, for instance, they will reject the hadith if it contradicts with their epistemology. And they will also, all the Quranic verses that are not according to their epistemology, they will just do ta'wil. And the same thing actually for Al-Ash'ariyya. The same thing for Al-Ash'ariyya. They just do ta'wil, and of course this is true in a lot of ways. Ibn Taymiyya, he focused especially on the sifat, on the divine attributes, because this was very polarizing that in that time. And for instance, we see that they will use this epistemology to reject, for instance, the fact that we will see God in the hereafter. So every hadith that is talking about aqidah already, we don't take it. We don't take it. But even the verses that are not going along with this epistemology, they will be interpreted. So the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says وُجُوهٌ يَوْمَئِذٍ نَاظِرَةٌ إِلَى رَبِّهَا نَاظِرَةٌ, this will be interpreted that, we will not see God in the hereafter, but we will, see Him like we see the moon or something in that sense. And for instance, when God says that He is in the heaven, then we should interpret this to say that He is high and He is above everything, etc. Or if God said that He is on the throne, we should interpret this and say that He is. That means that He is, He controls everything, etc., etc. And this is why Ibn Taymiyya, he called the Ash'aris and all the others, he called them al-Jahmiyya in his book بيان تلبيس الجهمية في تأسيس بدعهم الكلامية. Al-Jahmiyya comes from Jahm ibn Safwan, who was somebody who rejected all the divine attributes. And he thinking that Ash'ari also, and with this epistemology, they are rejecting the divine attributes. So, for instance, they reject the hikmah. They reject the hikmah as a divine attribute. And they said that God does not create with hikmah. That the universe was not created with a hikmah. Why? This epistemology applies here. Because what does the epistemology say? That the good and bad are not intrinsically present in the universe. Which means that God does not create things for a purpose. And it does not create things with hikmah, with wisdom. So they rejected this attribute of wisdom, etc. So this is why Ibn Taymiyya called them al-Jahmiyya, because they rejected the whole set of divine attributes from this epistemology that they put for themselves. And that is based here in this example on tahsin wa taqbih. So the Islamic schools of thought from an epistemological perspective, this is something that we already tackled yesterday. So we said that Ibn Taymiyya was thinking that all of them, there is an epistemological flaw in all the schools of all the Islamic schools of thought, and especially the schools of theology. But of course, you cannot have an epistemological deviation in theology without having this articulated in all the other branches of knowledge, as like methodology and usul al-fiqh, and even fiqh itself, etc. Because at the end of the day, theology, the aqidah, this is what controls everything. And so it will reflect in methodology. And it will reflect in fiqh, and it will reflect in all the areas. And we will see it later, how this epistemological flaw articulated into epistemological or methodological problems in usul al-fiqh and in other branches. We will see it later, inshallah. So we saw it yesterday that, it started with the philosophers, and then the Mu'tazilis and the Ash'aris replying to them. I don't know if... So the philosophers, and then it should be the people of hadith and fiqh, not the Sufis. I think there is a mistake here. Yeah. But anyhow, we saw this yesterday, So we said that the philosophers, and some of them, they just took philosophy as it is. Let me give you the point of view of Ibn Ashur, which is very similar to that of Ibn Taymiyya in this regard, because Ibn Ashur is a modern scholar. Right? He died in 1993, and in his book أليس الصبح بقريب, when he is talking about theology, he says something very similar to Ibn Taymiyya. He says that he categorizes the Islamic schools of thought or of theology in 4 categories. First categories are, he says, الزنادقة, or those, who accepted philosophy and they just rejected Sharia. And we have examples of scholars like this. Some even were executed, in history. And then he says we have philosophers and some mystic scholars, like Ibn al-Arabi, and who
Ibn al-Arabi or
Ibn Arabi.
Ibn Arabi. Two different.
Yeah, Ibn Arabi. Even though Ibn Arabi, actually his real name is Ibn al-Arabi. It's his real name, but they just do it to distinguish between the Qadi. So those people, so the philosophers and some Sufis, he said they adapted the frame of reference of philosophy and they tried to interpret Sharia to make it fit. So أول الشريعة في صالح الحكمة. So they interpreted Sharia in order to make it fit within philosophy. So those are the philosophers and mystics like Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina and Ibn Tufayl and etc. So their frame of reference, their epistemology is purely philosophical, and Sharia then should fit into that. And then he says you have the mutakallimun, which are Mu'tazila and Ash'a'ira and Maturidiyya and some Shia scholars and others who tried to interpret the philosophy to make it fit with Sharia. And then you have according to Ibn Ashur, the Salaf, or the Athariyun we can say, who just did not get into this debate, this philosophical and theological debates. They just refused to debate about those issues. And so according to Ibn Taymiyya, they did not even develop an epistemology. They don't have any epistemology. They just take the text as it is and that's it. And this is why Ibn Taymiyya was saying that actually they turned their back on the Quran and the Sunnah. Okay.
Ibn Taymiyya said the Salafiyya turned their back.
You was not here yesterday in the first part. We said that Ibn Taymiyya, he criticized, because I said there is a mistake here. It should not be Sufis. It should be people of Hadith and Fiqh. And Ibn Taymiyya, he said that. So he criticized. He said that all of them, they turned their back on the Quran and Sunnah, whether the philosophers, because historically speaking, we had the philosophers. Like I said yesterday, very early in the Islamic history, the philosophical works were translated into Arabic because the territories that were taken by Muslims, Egypt, Iraq, Persia, Syria, all of those territories were, whether there were Christians or, Zoroastrians, they had philosophy. Greek philosophy was actually the frame of reference and was very present. And when the Muslims took these territories, they started to translate those philosophical works from already the end of the first history century. And this is how actually some Muslims, they adopted philosophy and just rejected Sharia, and especially those who did those translations. And that's and this created a reaction from the Mu'tazila, who started to reply to those people, but by adapting some parts of this philosophy and trying to make it fit within Sharia, and this is how they created a hybrid, epistemology. And at the same time, along with the Mu'tazila, you had, so we are still in the period of the Salaf. And the attitude of the scholar, according to Ibn Taymiyya, of the Salaf, was an attitude who refuted the Mu'tazili and the philosophers' thought, but with an authentic Islamic epistemology. But this did not continue after the three first generations, and the scholar of Hadith and Fiqh, the attitude that they adopted is to reply on the Mu'tazila and the philosophers to say we should stick to Quran and Sunnah, but without developing an Islamic epistemology, without developing a rationality that is on the same level of complexity than what Mu'tazila has developed, in order to reply to it, and in order to make a rational system that is able to produce knowledge from the Quran, from the Quranic basis, or from the Quranic reference. And he said that those people actually, they thought that the Quran was just limited to its words. And he said in this way, both of them, Mu'tazila and Athariyun, so the people of the Hadith and the Fiqh, they turned their back to the Quran. And this is how the Ash'aris came later, and they replied to both. But they fell into the same problem of the Mu'tazila, that they developed a hybrid epistemology that is not based on the Quranic epistemology.
Does this mean that Ibn Taymiyya, actually, when he analyzed the situation of both camps, did he actually bring some new knowledge?
Of course.
Or just to analyze the situation and describe what they were doing, and he himself...
No, of course, no. It's not only a description. He tried, to bring up an authentic Islamic epistemology. But even at the end of his life, he regretted that he took too much time, analyzing and replying to the groups and not focusing more on the Quran. This is what he said at the end of his life. But he when replying to those groups, he brought up, the Quranic version or the Quranic alternative, and we will see this, inshallah. So now the thing is not to do taqlid of Ibn Taymiyya and say, he has the truth, but this is not the point. What's interesting here is that, he did the work of reassessment, and this is what we should do. So we should not take Ibn Taymiyya's word as granted, but we should reassess also the Islamic legacy on the epistemological basis to see to what extent it's corresponding to the to the Quranic epistemology. This is the point. And this is what's interesting in Ibn Taymiyya's approach. Not per se his results or his conclusions, but the fact that to reassess Islamic legacy on the right epistemological basis, and not take for granted the epistemology that was developed by the schools of thought.
Was this a reason why he was put in jail?
Of course, Ibn Taymiyya, he died in jail.
Because of this revolutionary type of...
Of course, Ibn Taymiyya was very, very influential, and the big scholars of his period were, very annoyed of him, and they managed to get him in jail. And even though he was in jail, he was still writing, and his writings were still influential. And then they stopped him, and they forbid him. They did not. He was not allowed to write anymore. And even in his biography, you can read that then he took just some carbonized pieces of wood, and he wrote with that on the walls. And this is in this situation he died, of course, because it was very. It's a period of taqlid, a period where you cannot contradict the school, whether it's the fiqh school or whether it's the theological school. It's very difficult. And he came with this revolutionary thoughts, which a lot saw as problematic, and even some were saying that he was just a kafir and going against ijma', going against consensus, and etc. Okay, now we will take some samples of epistemological flaws that were addressed by Ibn Taymiyya. First of all, the main principle of speculative theology on which the epistemological distortion is based. as you have noticed since yesterday, the issue that is coming back and back again is the issue of tahsin and taqbih. The issue of, whether intelligence, reason is able to identify good or bad, good and bad or not. So this issue and its numerous ramifications at the level of speculative theology is one of the main principles on which the epistemological distortion was based, actually. There is a study that is, I think it's a PhD dissertation, that is analyzing the influence of speculative theology on usul al-fiqh. And the researcher did statistics study. So he did al-istiqra, an induction of usul al-fiqh, to try to know which issue of kalam, of speculative theology, did influence the most usul al-fiqh. And he came to the conclusion that the issue that was the most present is the issue of tahsin and taqbih. And it's about around 50% of the speculative theology issues that is there in usul al-fiqh. But so it has a lot of ramification, and its influence actually on the epistemological level was very important. We gave some examples about the asma wa sifat and about the al-aql wa naql, etc. We will give some others now, inshallah. Yesterday I talked about this issue of tahsin and taqbih and its development and how it was developed, and it said that it's the first issue actually that created a conflict between the Mu'tazila and the Ahl Sunnah. This is said that Wasil ibn Ata, which is the founder of the Mu'tazila, it's one of the first issues on which he disagreed with his teacher Al-Hasan al-Basri. Because it was the issue of human action, and actually tahsin wa taqbih, it's derived from the issue of human action. Now we already said it yesterday. We said that the issue of tahsin wa taqbih comes from the issue of natural determinism. The naturalist philosophers like Aristotle, like we said yesterday, they think that everything, the whole universe, is just a whole system of that is regulated by causalities, and that God is outside of this, and that the system is just functioning, and that the causality has a power in itself. So the things has a causal power in themselves. They are causing each other without God interfering in them. This is natural determinism, and everything is just ruled by this and cannot derive from this causality and from this reality. And I said that Mu'tazila, when they saw this, replying to the philosophers, they partially adopted this natural determinism, but they say, yes, this is true, but it's God who is at the basis of those causes. It's true that everything is ruled by a system of causality, but it's God who put this causality in things, and though this causality is intrinsic in things. Like Aristotle said, it's intrinsic, but it's God who put it. And of course, they said that if this is true, and everything is ruled by God, then it's not possible that evil is part of it. It's part of God's creation. So evil in creation does not come from God, and it's not willed by Him, etc. So when the Ash'aris saw this, they found this problematic. How can you dismiss a part of the creation to be under God's control and under God's creation, etc. So what they did is that they just rejected natural causality as such, there is no cause in things that is, making things, derive from each other. And in this way, they found the solution of evil. So everything is created by God without any cause and effect between things, and there is no intrinsic cause in things, and there is no intrinsic value in things. So there is no intrinsic evil or good, and in this way, the problem of evil is solved. So everything comes from God, and nothing is evil or nothing is good. And this is how the issue of tahsin and taqbih, developed, and it had a lot of ramifications. Because now, that will mean that the reason is not able to identify good and bad because it just does not exist. So this is just a brief about the issue, but of course it's a lot more complex than that. But this is one of the main principles of speculative theology on which this epistemological distortion is based, and we will try to demonstrate this through a whole set of elements that are based on this principle. So this principle brought further a whole set of dichotomies, which are actually epistemological issues that are derived from this issue of tahsin and taqbih. The dichotomy of religious and elites and common people, the dichotomy of worship and human interest, the dichotomy of reason and revelation, dichotomy of worldly and otherworldly interest, dichotomy of universe and revelation, dichotomy of religion and human nature. This is a few of those dichotomies that were derived or were offsprings of this issue of tahsin and taqbih. First, let's start with the dichotomy of reason and revelation. So here, tahsin and taqbih is telling us that it's telling us that revelation does not respond to the logics of reason. Why? Because reason does not have the ability to identify good and bad, because it just does not exist. Which means that revelation did not come with logics that is working as per the logic of the reason, because the reason is not able to identify good and bad because it does not exist. So the logic of revelation is something that is coming from God, and it's subjective, it's not objective. So that means that reason and revelation are two things that can oppose, because they are not responding to the same referential. So they can contradict each other. So we should protect revelation from the derives of reason, because contradiction is possible. For instance, Shatibi, he says, فلا يصرح العقل في مجال النظر إلا بقدر ما يسرحه النقل، والدليل على ذلك أمور، منها ما تبين في علم الكلام والأصول من أن العقل لا يحسن ولا يقبح. So he says, we should not allow reason, we should not allow rational reflection only in the measure that is allowed by revelation. And the proof of that, so the reason should not be allowed to exercise only in the limits of revelation. And then he says the proof of that are different things. One of those proofs are ما تبين في علم كلام والأصول, what is established in theology and in usul fiqh, that reason is not able to identify good and bad. So here, this issue of tahsin al-taqbih, you see how Shatibi used it to say that we should preserve revelation from reason, and we should limit the scope of reason to the scope that revelation came with, because they are not responding to the same logics. They are not from the same, they don't have the same source, or they don't working according to the same, referential. So we should preserve revelation from reason. So this is the rationale behind this dichotomy. So you see that it's based on this tahsin wa taqbih. And of course, Ibn Taymiyya, he responded extensively to this issue, and saying that this issue is not, it has nothing to do with Islam. Of course, this is influenced by Greek philosophy, but Ibn Taymiyya is saying that this has no asl, no basis in Islam, this dichotomy between reason and revelation, because at the end of the day, reason, revelation came, of course, Ibn Taymiyya is not an Ash'ari, so he says that good and bad are intrinsic in things, and so reason is from God, and it's able to identify good and bad in revelation and in universe, and the reason is working to according to the same rationale than revelation, because they have one source. They come from Allah, and so sound reason cannot, it's impossible. So this dichotomy is just impossible. Sound reason cannot contradict revelation. It's just impossible, because God does not contradict himself. So he responded on that, and especially in his book Dar Ta'arud al-Aql wal-Naql, and other books also. And this is why, of course, we don't have time to study all every how do you say, aspect of Ibn Taymiyya's reply to this dichotomy, because once again, this dichotomy between reason and revelation, it has a lot of ramification. It has a lot of ramifications, and Ibn Taymiyya addressed those ramifications in epistemology and in methodology, how this dichotomy created things in those disciplines, and he replied to a lot of ramifications. We don't have the time to do this, but just one example. This is why, for instance, Ibn Taymiyya, he refused to divide the sciences in ulum aqliya wa shar'iyya, in rational sciences and sharia sciences. He refused this. And he was saying that all the ulum in a way or another are sharia, because once again, what is Islamic science and what is rational science? At the end of the day, everything comes from God. And he is saying, for instance, so it's a long development of Ibn Taymiyya, talking about this division of ulum shar'iyya and ulum aqliya. And he said, in the best, in the worst case, we can talk about ulum naqliya and ulum aqliya, but not ulum shar'iyya and ulum aqliya. For instance, he said, just quickly, وقد تبين بهذا أن كل علم عقلي أمر الشرع به أو دل الشرع عليه فهو شرعي أيضا، إما باعتبار الأمر أو الدلالة أو باعتبارهما جميعا. So he says, that each rational discipline is also Islamic for different reasons, because Islam is يأمر به, is recommending it, and Islam is also indicating it, guiding towards it, and then he's also talking about the fact that Islam is also corresponding. It also corresponds to the revelation. So he is against this, and this is coming once again from this dichotomy of reason, revelation. But once again, there are so many ramifications of this dichotomy that created epistemological and methodological issues in Islamic thought, and that Ibn Taymiyya addressed. Okay, another example of another dichotomy is the dichotomy of worldly and otherworldly interests. The rationale behind this dichotomy is that So we saw, according to this epistemology of tahsin and taqbih, there is maslaha does not exist. And we are talking about interests, maslaha. The maslaha, the interest, has no objective reality. It does not exist. Which means that everything that revelation came with is actually ta'abbudi, is actually just worship. Because at the end of the day, the point is not to realize any interest, because the interest does not exist. So it becomes what? Ta'abbud. And if there is an interest for the human being in this world, well, this is secondary and this is not the objective. Now I'm not inventing this. I'm quoting Shatibi. If there is an interest in this world, so everything, the relation is ta'abbud, is just to worship, because there is no maslaha, there is no real maslaha. Because at the end of the day, this is the Ash'ari epistemology. If revelation has came with shirk, or with zina, or with khamr, it would have been possible. And we would have been obliged to abide by it. Because God does what He wants, and shirk or zina is not bad, and neither good. So it's just ta'abbud. We are just abiding by revelation to worship God and to obey God, and not for any interest. And if there is by accident an interest that we can find in this world, then it's a secondary and it's not the objective. So the only purpose is the reward of the hereafter that you will get for abiding by revelation and for just being just doing ta'abbud. So this is the rationale behind this dichotomy. You see once again how it's stemming from the tahsin and the taqbih. And of course, Ibn Taymiyya also extensively replied to this dichotomy of worldly and otherworldly maslaha. I will not go into details. Let me just quote quickly of what he said. So there is a long passage, but I will quote just a few lines. He said, وَقَوْمٌ مِنَ الْخَائِضِينَ فِي أُصُولِ الْفِقْهِ. So people that are studying أصول الفقه وتعليل الأحكام الشرعية بالأوصاف المناسبة إذا تكلموا في المناسبة etc. etc. He said those people رأوا أن المصلحة نوعان أخروية ودنيوية وجعلوا الدنيوية ما تضمن حفظ الدماء والأمور والأموال والفروج والعقول والدين الظاهر وأعرضوا عما في العبادات الباطنة والظاهرة من أنواع المعارف بالله وملائكته وكتبه etc. وغير ذلك من أنواع المصالح في الدنيا والآخرة. So Ibn Taymiyya here is saying that those people of Usul Fiqh, they have categorized maslaha into otherworldly and worldly, interest into otherworldly and worldly, and that they said that the worldly interest, they reduce the worldly interest to some material and visible things, and they have turned their back on العبادات الباطنة والظاهرة. He means العبادات الباطنة, he means spirituality and theology or creed. والظاهرة, he means so the worship like prayer etc. And this is why he's quoting المعارف بالله وملائكته وكتبه etc. So they turn their back on theology or creed and on worship, on spirituality etc. So here, this dichotomy, worldly and otherworldly, those scholars, what did they say? They say the worldly maslaha or the otherworldly maslaha, everything that has to do with aqidah and that has to do with worship, ibadat, there is no maslaha, there is no worldly maslaha in this. You're just believing in God, etc., etc., and just doing your ibadat for otherworldly purposes, and this has no worldly maslaha. And he replied to this dichotomy by saying, and here at the end he says that actually everything is, there is no, that this does not exist, because everything that revelation came with has a worldly purpose and another worldly purpose. He said, okay, so he said this somewhere. Yeah. وغير ذلك من أنواع المصالح في الدنيا والآخرة. So he's against this dichotomy, and he's replying to this and thinking that they reduced the worldly masalih, to some material and some material things. And then from this dichotomy stems another dichotomy, is a dichotomy of worship and interest. So what is the rationale behind this dichotomy? Like we said before, if there is no objective good in things, then why is God telling you to do them? So you don't have any interest in what God is telling you in this world, because good and bad does not exist. So there is no maslahah, there is no benefit, no worldly benefit in worship. And the only objective is to be ta'abbud, is to worship. And so worships, ibadat, were not established or are not corresponding to the human spiritual needs. And there is no initiate, or there is no innate aspiration to worship in the human being. Shatibi, he says about worship, ليس للإنسان فيه خادم طبعي باعث على مقتضى الطلب بل ربما كان مقتضى الجبلة يمانعه وينازعه كالعبادات لأنها مجرد تكليف. It's مجرد تكليف, and there is no, like Shatibi says, there is no خادم طبعي باعث على مقتضى الطلب. There is no natural aspiration for this. It's مجرد تكليف. It's just, it's just something that God has charged you with. And of course, Shatibi, he replies to, we can say, yes, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran about worship, إن الصلاة تنهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر. So here we have a benefit. And Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, أرحنا بها يا بلال. So make us, apaise-nous, give us serenity with it, O Bilal. Of course, Shatibi is a scholar. He's aware about this, and he brings all these arguments and he replied to them, saying, yes, of course, those are benefits, but this is secondary and this is not the objective. If you have this, say Alhamdulillah, but this is not the objective, and this is not what worship is for, and it's just an accident, عارض, and not al-asl. And it's the same thing for, like we said, al-aqidah, for creed. It's like worship. It's only taklif. It's only, something that God has charged you with in order to have the reward in the hereafter. And once again, in usul fiqh, when the scholars talked about haqq Allah wa haqq al-ibad, in haqq Allah, they have different categories. One of the categories is al-ibad al-mahdha, the purely worship, which does not have any worldly interest. And here they categorize creed, al-aqaid, and they categorize al-ibadat. It's ibadah mahdha. And this is according to this, epistemology. Okay, then we have the dichotomy of the dichotomy of universe and revelation. According to Ibn Taymiyya, the Islamic schools of thought, all of them actually, even the Ahl Hadith, I did not put it here, they they opposed in a way or in another universe and revelation, all of them. The philosophers, for instance, they said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not aware about the details of the creation. So the revelation is not concerned with the details of revelation, because Allah doesn't know the details. How can He reveal something about something that He does not know, is not aware about? Because, like I said before, the philosophers, they adopted, a lot of them, the natural determinism, which means that God is like just one who made a watch, and He launched it, and then the watch is just functioning by itself. So He does not know the details, because He's above that. He's above the details, above the juz'iyat. So the revelation does not address those details. So here you see how there is a dichotomy between revelation and universe within among some philosophers. Mu'tazila also, they had a kind of dichotomy, because there are a whole set of things in the universe that was not created by God and is not willed by God. Like we said, because everything that has to do with evil, with shurur, is not from God's will and not from God's creation. So we have this dichotomy. Al-Asha'ira, they said that the irada takwiniya, the universal will, the divine universal will, His will in the universe, is opposing, or does not go along with the irada tashri'iyya. Those are two things that are not going along. الإرادة التكوينية والإرادة التشريعية. And Shatibi said it clearly. لا تلازم بينهما. So the divine, the universal will, His will in the universe is something, and His will in the revelation is something else. So here is an opposition between universe and revelation once again, according to this epistemology. And some Sufis also, they opposed revelation and universe, because for some Sufis, al-haqiqa goes above the sharia. And the final purpose is al-haqiqa al-kawniyya is the final purpose and give you the final knowledge. And this is also a kind of opposition between. So this list that I just made here is Ibn Taymiyya. I did not invent it. It's Ibn Taymiyya. And of course, Ibn Taymiyya, like we saw before, also he's blaming also the Ahl al-Fiqh and Ahl al-Hadith for the same thing, because they said that they opposed also revelation and universe, because and they opposed also reason and universe, because reason and revelation, because for they sometimes they resisted that reason could play a role in revelation, and the revelation is limited to what it says literally, and it does not have any rational system. And we can find it in some Salafi scholars, for instance al-Qahtani, who died in the 5th century, I think, a Salafi Andalusian Maliki scholar. He says in his poetry, وَكَذَا الشَّرِيعَةُ لِلطَّبِيعَةِ ضِدُّهَا وَلَقَلَّ مَا يَتَجَمَّعُ الضِّدَّانِ. He says Sharia and Tabi'ah are two things that oppose themselves, and two things that oppose themselves, they cannot be joined. Of course, we have to put this in the context, because he's replying to the philosophers, to the natural philosophers. But this is something that we can find in different trends of Islamic thought.
You did not include here the al-Hadith also.
No, because in this categorization, Ibn Taymiyya did not include them. But even though in other parts of his works, he's talking about this. He's saying clearly that they turn their back. It's like, revelation does not have anything to do with reason, etc. He said it, but not in this. Yeah. Okay, so the rationale behind this dichotomy. Let's just take the Ash'ari stand. The rationale behind this dichotomy. So once again, you go back to the issue of tahsin and taqbih. so if the creation does not have any intrinsic value, that will mean that it doesn't have anything to do with revelation, you know, because in revelation there is a value which is, you know, subjective and which is you know, attributed to revelation by God, while there is no value in creation. So that would mean that, you know, revelation does not correspond. There is dichotomy between revelation and universe, and revelation or universal has nothing to do with directing a human being to ethics. Shatibi, he says, القصد التشريع شيء والقصد الخلق شيء آخر لا تلازم بينهما. So which means that the revelational purpose is something, and the universal purpose is something else, and there is no talazum, there is no
Coexistence.
Correlation.
yeah, correlation.
There is no necessary coexistence.
Yeah, there is no necessary correlation or coexistence between them. Because here, Shatibi is saying this in a context where he is talking about the harm and the difficulty and maybe even the evil that can occur from abiding by revelation. Because, you know, it's known when you abide by revelation, when you worship, etc., you will find some hardship, you will find maybe some difficulties, etc. And he is saying those difficulties in revelation, in abiding by revelation, in sticking to the ahkam, etc., this hardship, this is not willed by God. Because why? Because revelation has a value that God put in it. And the opposite of this value, which is hardship and etc., this is not willed by God, because God does not contradict himself. But in creation, everything is willed by God, and everything is loved by God, even the evil, even, you know, the killing, and even everything. Why? Because in revelation there is no, and because there is no value in creation. So this is willed by God. And here Ibn Taymiyya, he replies to this. Of course, Ibn Taymiyya, he lived before Shatibi, but he's replying to this because Shatibi did not come up with this. You know, this existed in the Ash'ari tradition. He replied to this by, you know, distinguishing between two things, between al-mashi'a and al-irada, and showing that actually the objective behind what we see as evil in the... So he's showing that there is no dichotomy between revelation and universe. And in the universe, but evil is not, as in revelation, evil is not wanted by God. And harm is not wanted by God. Neither in revelation, neither in the universe. And what is wanted by God behind the evil that we see is the good behind it. So evil is not the objective, but the objective behind it is the objective is the good behind it. And this is where he made the distinction between Mashi'a and Irada. And it's a long development that he made, very beautiful actually, development where he is demonstrating that in the Quran, never Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala attributes evil to himself. When he's talking about evil, for instance, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَإِذَا أَذَقْنَاهُمْ نَعْمَاءَ بَعْدَ ضَرَّاءَ مَسَّتْهُمْ. When we make them prove na'ma, so the benediction, blessings, after that dharra, after that harm has hidden them. So when he's talking about na'ma, the blessings, he said, we have made them prove blessings. He's talking about him. But when he says that the harm has hidden them, he's not saying after that we have hidden them with harm, but he's talking بالمبني بالمجهول للمجهول. So it has hidden them, and not God has hidden them with the harm. So, and this is throughout, like explained by Ibn Taymiyya, throughout the Quran, and this is why the hadith says وَالشَّرُّ لَيْسَ إِلَيْكَ. Why, says Ibn Taymiyya? Because evil in the creation is not wanted by God and is not objective, and is something that is relative, and at the end of the day, the good behind it, this is the objective. For instance, when I kill brutally a child, this is evil, bad. But actually, this is not wanted by God, but what is wanted is the good behind it. And the good behind it, one of the elements of the good behind it is that the fact that I'm able to kill a child is very good. Because if I was not able to kill a child, which means that I'm not a human being. And it means there is no humanity. If there is no free will, no humanity. So this is good. But this evil is relative. It's relative and is not absolute.
Is there a distinction between a tragedy and evil? Like bad things that happen outside of our will, like an earthquake, volcano, and I don't know, death, disease, and things that are made out of the free will of the humans. Do they do this?
Natural evil and
natural evil and yeah. So what is the question?
Do they do this distinction when they speak about evil, or they just speak about evil in general? Either it's made by the human or it's...
Yeah, it's a shurur al-kawniyya, and all of it actually is related to al-irada al-takwiniyya. Because for instance, somebody who kills somebody, this is not... this is why he makes a difference between mashia and irada. This is something that God has willed as irada, but he does not will it as mashia. So this is the distinction. So here, this is actually also a natural, something that is from the irada takwiniyya, as the earthquake is from the irada takwiniyya.
Professor, how do you comment about, like we have in Quran, وَيَهْدِي بِهِ مَنْ يَشَاءُ وَيُضِلُّ بِهِ مَنْ يَشَاءُ? Like there is kind of every evil that is coming from the bad path. So that is also in Quran that Allah gives the good path to whomever he wants, and he gives the bad path.
Yes, but this is not done in an arbitrary way. So of course everything, is under God's will. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will guide those who He wills. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran also, وَلَوْ عَلِمَ فِيهِمْ خَيْرًا لَأَسْمَعَهُم. If God knows that there is good in you, He will make you hear the truth, hear receive the revelation. So this is not done in an arbitrary way that you will be guided and you will not. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala looks at your willingness and your sincerity. And then he will give you the guidance, and it's not an arbitrary way. So here we were still talking about the rationale behind the dichotomy of universe and revelation. Okay, and we said that how the rationale according to the Ash'aris is that there is no good and evil in revelation, so everything is willed by God, and so here this is the way they oppose universe and revelation, and that universe and revelation does not correspond to the universal order. It does not correspond, to the universe, and those are two things that are not going along. And of course, and we said also the position of Ibn Taymiyya and how Ibn Taymiyya replied to this. And he, just let me quote him. He says, وَفِرْقَةٌ, he's talking about Ash'ariyya, لما رأت أنه خالق هذا كله ولم تؤمن أنه خلق هذا لحكمة بل قالت إذا كان يخلق هذا فيجوز أن يخلق كل شر ولا يخلق شيئا لحكمة. So yeah, because of this question of tahsin and taqbih, the Ash'aris, according to Ibn Taymiyya, says that Allah created everything and they did not believe that He created it with a purpose. So, and they said that it's possible that Allah creates everything and creates every evil, and because there is no, there is no intrinsic value in what we see as evil. So here, this opposition again, and and we already tackled, the position of Ibn Taymiyya about this. Okay, I think I took more than my time, but so we will not tackle the issue of dichotomy of religion and human nature. But anyhow, this is also a dichotomy that exists. Let me just quickly quote here Shatibi, for instance. He says, yeah. So according to Shatibi, the fitra, because the issue of tahsin and taqbih, so in the human nature there is no intrinsic good and there is no intrinsic evil. And so the human being is not an ethical being, essentially, or not an evil being also. But he can have natural inclinations to evil, and he can have natural inclinations to good. And so, if he has natural inclinations to good, then it's allowed, permissible for him to follow them. And if he has natural inclinations to evil, then the Sharia is there to get him out عن داعية طبعه, to get him out of his nature. Yes, so this is also the dichotomy between religion and also, so religion was not established. Revelation was not revealed according to the human natural aspirations. And if the revelation, goes along with some human natural aspirations, this is once again secondary, and this is not the basis of things, according to Shatibi. Okay, and then Ibn Taymiyya also replies to this. I think we don't have a lot of time to. Let me just take some consequences of the epistemological crisis on theology, methodology, and ijtihad. We have already tackled this yesterday, and just quickly, very quickly. So we see how this gave an epistemological basis to separate aqidah from life, because aqidah at the end of the day is just worship. The only purpose is to worship it. So how aqidah, does not have any role anymore to play in daily life, and even in fiqh and intellectual production. This played a role also on the fact that the universe and the fitra were somehow dismissed from usul fiqh, and most of the scholars of usul fiqh are Ash'ari scholars, and they stated clearly that the only source is revelation, because reason and universe, they don't have any value, and so they should be dismissed in the sources of the fiqh and sources also of Islamic production, intellectual production. Also, the marginalization of rational instruments from the methodology of ijtihad. Those rational instruments were marginalized because at the end of the day, reason cannot identify good and bad, and the only way is the revelation. And here Al-Ghazali, he stated this clearly. And for him, all the rational tools are to be dismissed. He said this for instance in Mustasfa, because if those tools are only rational, he says, then we don't need them, because reason does not have any authority. And if those rational tools are corresponding to revelation, then we don't need them either also, because we have revelation, it's enough. So I think, just to end, I think that Islamic thought should be reappraised on the right epistemological basis in order to be able to, articulate a genuine and authentic Islamic ethics in modern time reality. Because often when we try to reappraise Islamic thought in order to develop, a discourse to address contemporary issues, often we are not aware that we are dealing within an epistemology actually that has some problems and that need to be reappraised, and we are taking it for granted. We are taking that for granted without, asking those epistemological questions and reassessing Islamic legacy on the right epistemological basis, going back to revelation. Once again, as I said it, the point here is not to just blindly follow Ibn Taymiyya. The point is that when we reassess epistemological Islamic disciplines, it should be done on the basis of a Quranic epistemology and not on the basis of the epistemology that was developed throughout history and take that for granted to reappraise Islamic thought. And I can give you one quick example. Wa'il Halaq, you may know him, he wrote an article arguing that the door of ijtihad has never been closed. And in the very beginning of his article, he is defining ijtihad in a way that contradicts his whole thesis. So he is saying that ijtihad is the fact of going back to the text if it's not possible, if the opinion was not mentioned in one of the schools, or if you cannot do analogy of the school on the basis of the school. So this is taqlid. This is just taqlid. So he's defining ijtihad according to the epistemology of a classical epistemology, which defines ijtihad in terms of taqlid, and saying that this never stopped. It was always ongoing. So he is saying basically taqlid was always ongoing. So here, for me, this is a good example to see how, when reassess Islamic thought, if you don't do it on the right epistemological basis, and if you don't define what ijtihad should look like according to the Quranic epistemology and not according to how it ended up to, then you will reassess, the Islamic legacy on the wrong epistemological basis, and you will just continue, the epistemological distortions that has occurred throughout history. Wallahu a'lam wa ahkam. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.